Delaney Shaw had been on her feet for 14 hours before she ever touched the door of Anchor Point. 14 hours. 3 codes. 1 kid who didn't make it. She didn't let herself think about the kid. Not yet. Not here. She'd learned a long time ago that grief had to wait its turn, that it stood in line behind everything else, patient as a bill collector. And it always got paid eventually. Just not tonight. Tonight she wanted a beer she wasn't going to finish, and a stool at the end of the bar where nobody would talk to her. San Diego at dusk smelled like salt and diesel, and the particular exhaustion of a Navy town that never really slept, just dimmed. Anchor Point sat 2 blocks off base, wedged between a tattoo parlor and a surf shop that hadn't sold a board in years. And it had the kind of low gold light that made everyone inside look a little more forgiven than they deserved to be. She pushed through the door, scrub still on, hair falling out of its bun in loose brown strands that stuck to her neck. She didn't care. Caring took energy, and she had none left to spend on how she looked walking into a bar full of strangers, which was her first mistake. Because nothing in that room was a stranger to nothing. Everyone in Anchor Point knew everyone. Except her. She found her stool, ordered a beer, set her phone face down on the bar because if it buzzed one more time tonight, if the hospital called her back in for even one more thing, she was going to walk into the ocean and keep walking. The bar was loud in the particular way that meant nobody was actually listening to anyone. Pool balls cracking, a jukebox nobody had picked. Laughter that came in bursts, the kind that needed an audience to sustain itself. She let it wash over her, didn't process any of it, just sat there with her beer sweating a ring onto the wood, and her eyes doing that thing they always did, cataloging exits without her permission, counting heads, clocking hands. She hated that her eyes still did that. 10 years and they still did that. At the far table, 5 men in matching blue shirts were getting louder by the minute. Navy SEALs. She knew the type before she knew the unit patch, the posture, the way they took up space like the room owed them rent. One of them, big, bald, arms, like something out of an anatomy textbook, kept glancing her way and grinning at his buddies like he'd found something funny. She didn't look back. Didn't need to. She could feel him coming before he stood up, the way you can feel weather change in your knees. Oops. His beer hit her jacket first, then rolled down onto her t-shirt, warm and cheap and deliberate. My bad, sweetheart. She looked down at the stain. Gray shirt, now darker. She didn't say anything. This ain't a place for tourists, baby. He leaned in close enough that she could smell the whiskey doing his talking for him. Bald head shining under the neon beer sign behind him. Blue shirt stretched tight over a chest built for a different kind of war than the one he was fighting right now, which was apparently a war against a woman who hadn't said a single word to him. Anchor Points for real warriors. You should head home. His table erupted. High fives. The particular laughter of men who'd already decided how this story would end before it started. Delaney reached for the napkin dispenser, pulled out 3, started blotting the beer off her shirt with slow, even strokes. Because that's what you do with a wound, some part of her whispered. You don't flinch at it. You just clean it and keep moving. The man laughed louder, mistook her silence for something it wasn't. Hey. His hand closed around her wrist. Big hand. The kind that had probably closed around a lot of things without asking. I'm talking to you. And that was the second mistake, because his fingers landed on skin marked by a small circular scar, old and pale and round, the kind that healed clean, because someone had known exactly what they were doing when they closed it. He didn't notice it. Not yet. He was too busy grinning at his friends, waiting for the room to keep laughing with him. The room did not get the chance. What happened next took under 2 seconds, and later, when the videos surfaced online, people would slow them down frame by frame and still argue about how she'd done it. 1 second his hand was on her wrist. The next, he was face down on the bar, his arm wrenched up behind his back at an angle that made his teammates go silent mid-law. His cheek pressed into a puddle of his own spilled beer. Nobody had seen her stand up. That was the part that would haunt the footage. 1 frame she's sitting. The next frame he's down. Nothing in between that the human eye could track. The bar went quiet in that specific way a room goes quiet right before something worse happens, or right before everyone realizes nothing worse is coming, and they haven't decided yet which one this is. In the corner booth, a man in his 40s with silver, threading through a military buzz cut, set his whiskey glass down with a small, sharp click. Master Chief Deshaun Reyes had spent 22 years in special operations, and 22 years teaches a man to recognize things other people miss. The angle of that arm lock. Textbook. The weight distribution. Not a self-defense class. Not a weekend seminar with a rubber knife and a laminated certificate at the end. That was muscle memory. That was something drilled into a body across thousands of repetitions in places where getting it wrong meant somebody didn't come home. Let him go. The voice belonged to a woman standing up from the SEAL table. Blonde hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked like it hurt. Posture like a plumb line. Captain Renee Foss had the particular stillness of someone who had spent her whole career being the only woman in rooms full of men who needed reminding, constantly, that she outranked them. Delaney released the man's arm. Sat back down like nothing had happened. Picked her phone back up off the bar, glanced at the blank screen, set it down again. Unhurried. Like she was conserving something for later. You just assaulted a United States Navy SEAL. Foss's voice carried, meant to. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you're in? Delaney didn't answer that either. The man on the bar pushed himself up, face red, rubbing his wrist where her grip had left white marks already going pink. Lucky shot, he muttered. But something in his eyes said otherwise. Something in his eyes said he'd gone through Bud Sesh and advanced operator training and never once been taken down that fast. That clean. That quiet. Water, please. Delaney's voice, when it finally came, carried a soft Midwest flatness that took the edge off every word. With ice. Eli Torres filled the glass slow, watching her the whole time. 3 years behind that bar had taught him to read a room the way other men read box scores. He'd seen every flavor of military posturing there was. Watched 100 civilian confrontations play out exactly the same predictable way. This wasn't that. Water instead of another beer. Eyes that had already mapped every exit in the building before she'd finished her first sip. Those weren't things you picked up in a weekend. That was Krav Maga. A slurred voice rose from the corner. Sully Pruitt, gray-bearded, faded army jacket hanging loose on a frame that used to fill it out. His eyes were glassy with bourbon, but there was something underneath the glass that hadn't gone soft with age. Military Krav Maga. Not the version they teach at the gym on Tuesday nights. Lucky grab. A new voice, thick with a Slavic accent, amused. Nate Kowalski sat near the dartboard, built wide and dense. The particular kind of muscle that came from years in places where paychecks arrived in cash and nobody asked follow-up questions. Little Nurse probably watched YouTube video. The word nurse rippled through the room. Somebody had recognized her scrubs, the faded logo over the pocket. Coronado Medical Center. The story started writing itself in real time. Tired healthcare worker gets lucky against an elite operator, and Delaney watched the tension in the room ease just slightly, replaced by the particular electricity that precedes every bar fight in every military town in America. She let them think it. Let the story write itself wrong, because being underestimated wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. She'd built her whole life around it. Every scrub top, every quiet nod, every time she let a room decide she was smaller than she was, that wasn't weakness. That was 35 years of practice. Across the room near the door, Nina Alvarez froze mid-step, still in her hospital badge, still smelling like antiseptic and the particular exhaustion of a 12-hour shift. Her eyes found Delaney immediately. Jess, she caught herself. Delaney. Delaney gave the smallest shake of her head. Almost nothing. Enough. Nina stopped where she was, found a seat close enough to help, far enough not to make things worse. She'd worked beside Delaney for 2 years now, had watched her handle gunshot wounds and multi-car pileups with a calm that came from somewhere deeper than nursing school ever taught. She'd never asked where that calm came from. Tonight, some part of her was starting to wonder if she was about to find out anyway. You got lucky. The big man had found his voice again, his pride climbing back up off the floor along with the rest of him. Wade Griffin. That was his name. Someone in the crowd had said it, passed it around like a rumor. But luck runs out. How about we settle this properly? Arm wrestling. Right here. Right now. His table cheered. This was familiar ground. A contest of pure strength, where technique mattered less than the size of your forearm. Griffin had never lost an arm wrestling match on his team. Not once. Delaney took a slow sip of water. No, thank you. Scared? Foss stepped in close, her voice dripping with the specific condescension reserved for civilians who didn't understand the difference between them and everyone else in the room. I don't blame you. Beating someone in a surprise attack is one thing. Facing them in a real contest is another. The crowd was growing now. Pool games abandoned. Conversations dying mid-sentence as people drifted closer to whatever this was becoming. Somewhere, a phone had already started recording. Tell me something. Delaney turned, slow to face Foss directly. Third phase of Bud's Week 5. What's the standard procedure for underwater knot tying when your dive buddy experiences shallow water blackout? The question landed like a dropped glass. Sharp. Everyone heard it break. Because that wasn't a question you pulled off the internet. That wasn't a question from a documentary or a recruitment video with dramatic music over it. That was the kind of detail that lived inside a training pipeline and nowhere else. Foss's confident expression cracked just barely, just enough. How would you? Because the procedure they teach is wrong. Delaney's voice never climbed above conversational. Never needed to. The recovery position they mandate increases the risk of secondary drowning. Any combat medic who's actually dealt with a real blackout scenario would know that. Eli had stopped polishing the same glass he'd been polishing for a full minute now. His hands rested flat on the bar. He recognized precision when he heard it. This wasn't second-hand knowledge dressed up to sound impressive. This was somebody who'd been there. Prove it. Eli reached under the bar and came up with a Glock, unloaded. The one he kept for the concealed carry classes he ran out of the back room on slow Tuesdays. You talk like you know weapons. Let's see it. How fast can you field strip this? Delaney looked at the weapon, looked back at him. 15 seconds with proper tools. 23 without. 23 seconds. Eli let out a short laugh, not unkind, just disbelieving. The record in this bar is 32. Set by a SEAL Team 6 operator on a slow Thursday night. Show me. She picked the weapon up left-handed. Her right hand never let go of the water glass. What happened next would get replayed 100,000 times before the week was out. Analyzed frame by strangers, with too much time and too much interest in weapons they'd never fired. Her movements were economical, precise, almost boring in their efficiency. No flourish, no performance. Just the systematic disassembly of a weapon by someone whose hands had done this so many times that thinking about it would only slow her down. Slide off, barrel free, recoil spring separated. Each piece set down on the bar in a straight line, oriented exactly the way an armorer trains a body to arrange them without ever consciously deciding to. 15.4. Eli's voice cracked on the number. Seconds. With one hand. The bar had gone silent, except for whatever song nobody remembered picking, playing soft and useless over speakers nobody was listening to anymore. Even the pool players had stopped mid-shot, cue sticks frozen in the air like a photograph nobody had taken yet. Griffin stood there, his arm wrestling challenge forgotten, his face doing the math on a woman he'd decided, 20 minutes ago, wasn't worth a second look. You smell like death. Sully Pruitt had gotten to his feet, weaving. His bloodshot eyes locked on Delaney with an intensity that had nothing left of drunk in it. Not the hospital kind. The other kind. The kind that follows you home from places most people never have to think about. That's enough, old man. Kowalski rose from his table, his shadow falling long and wide across the floor as he crossed the room. Smart-mouth nurse needs a lesson in respect. Where I come from, we have a way of dealing with women who forget their place. The tension in the room climbed another notch. Somewhere near the entrance, the bouncer's hand drifted toward the bat he kept behind the door. Delaney didn't move. Only her feet shifted. A small adjustment beneath the bar stool That meant she was, in fact, paying very close attention. When Kowalski grabbed for her shoulder, it came the way he'd thrown every punch in every country he'd been paid to fight in direct, brutal, built to establish dominance before the other person even understood there was a contest. His hand never made it. She moved with the grab instead of against it. His own momentum betrayed him. Her weight shifted. Her body rotated. A foot swept his ankle, and an elbow found his solar plexus with a precision that had nothing to do with luck, and everything to do with 3 specific pressure points struck in exact sequence. His diaphragm seized. The air left his body, and didn't come back for a very long 4 seconds. She hadn't stood up. Still on the stool, water glass still in hand, like she'd swatted a fly. "Who taught you that?" The new voice came from the doorway, where a man in his 50s had just walked in flanked by 2 aides, the kind of officer whose presence changed the temperature of a room before he said a word. Colonel Harlan Voss commanded Naval's Special Warfare Group in this region, and his eyes found Delaney with the specific focus of a predator, recognizing something it hadn't expected to find in this particular field: that takedown. He crossed the room slow, deliberate. That's not standard CQC. That's not even Special Operations standard. That's something else. In his corner booth, Reyes had already pulled out his phone, his voice low and urgent, his weathered face gone pale under its permanent tan. He'd seen something in that 4-second sequence that connected to briefings held in rooms without recording devices, where certain names were never spoken out loud. Outside, unnoticed by everyone inside, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot and idled there, engine running, headlights cutting through the early dark. And 2 blocks away, in a car stopped at a red light. Reagan Shaw's phone buzzed with an alert from a stringer at the station. Viral bar video, San Diego, trending fast, might be worth a look. She glanced at the thumbnail without really seeing it. A crowd, a bar, somebody's arm twisted behind their back. She almost scrolled past it, almost. Instead, she made a U-turn 2 blocks earlier than her exit, telling herself it was just instinct, the kind every good reporter developed, the kind that had nothing to do with the fact that her sister worked shifts 2 miles from this exact bar and hadn't answered a text in 6 hours. Back inside Anchor Point, Griffin had found his courage again, bolstered now by rank and numbers standing behind him. He moved to stand with his teammates, forming a loose half-circle that didn't look like a threat and was absolutely a threat, boxing Delaney in against the bar. "Everyone who's served has a call sign." His voice carried now, meant for the whole room. "If you're really what you're claiming to be, some kind of operator, then you've got one. So let's hear it." Delaney set her water glass down with deliberate care. Ice cubes clinking, the sound absurdly loud in a room gone silent. "I don't have a call sign," she said. "Bullshit." Foss's voice cracked with disbelief. "Everyone in Special Operations has a call sign. It's not optional. It's identity. You're lying." Murmurs of agreement moved through the crowd. Common knowledge. This. Call signs weren't decoration. They were earned through moments that defined a person among their peers. Moments too specific to fake, too particular to steal. To claim training without one was like claiming to be a surgeon who'd never held a scalpel. "Last chance." Griffin's voice dropped low, a growl now. "Tell us your call sign, or we're going to assume you're just another wannabe playing soldier. And trust me, we don't take kindly to stolen valor in this bar." The room had shifted from entertainment into something older. Something about honor and the sacred line separating people who'd served from people who only claimed to who. Every phone in Anchor Point was up now, angled, recording, waiting to see if the mystery woman would break. Because that's what this had become. A test. A dare. A door she either walked through or didn't. Reyes ended his call and stood slowly from his corner booth. Whatever he'd heard on the other end of that line had rearranged something behind his eyes. 22 years of Special Operations. And he looked, for a moment, like a man who'd just been handed news he didn't have language for yet. "Stand down," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd given orders in places where following them meant the difference between a body coming home and not. "All of you, step back. Now." Griffin hesitated. caught between loyalty to his crew and a lifetime of training that said, "You obeyed senior enlisted without question." His pride wouldn't let him back all the way down. "She needs to answer the question, Master Chief." "What's her call sign?" "She's mine." The front door of Anchor Point burst open with enough force to send it slamming into the wall behind it. Every head in the bar turned at once. Rear Admiral Patrick Doyle stood in the doorway. Civilian clothes jeans. A faded polo did nothing to soften the command presence radiating off him like heat off asphalt. He was breathing hard, like he'd run the last 100 yards from his car. His eyes swept the room in a tactical assessment that took less than 2 seconds. The crowd, the SEALs, Kowalski, still on the floor gasping for air. Then his eyes found Delaney's face, and something in his expression came apart. She met his gaze, and for the first time all evening the composure she'd worn like a second skin cracked, just barely, her shoulders tensing, her hands, which had stayed perfectly still through every provocation, trembling now. Not from fear, from something closer to memory refusing to stay buried. "Admiral." Colonel Voss stepped forward, confused by the sudden appearance of flag rank at what should have been a routine bar disturbance. "We have a situation." Doyle raised a hand. Voss stopped mid-sentence. The silence in that bar had a texture to it now, thick, waiting. "Say it." Griffin, emboldened by the sudden arrival of the highest-ranking man he'd ever stood in a room with, pushed one more time. "Tell everyone your call sign, or admit you're a fraud." Delaney rose slowly from her stool. At 5'6", surrounded by men built like door frames, she should have looked small. She didn't. Something in the way she planted her feet, squared her shoulders, made the room around her feel like it had gotten smaller instead. She looked at Griffin. Her eyes held his the way a held breath holds a room. When she spoke, her voice barely rose above a whisper. It reached every corner of Anchor Point anyway. Viper 1. Griffin had a beer bottle halfway to his lips, a gesture of dismissive confidence, ready for whatever lie he assumed was coming. The bottle never made it. His hand froze mid-air, muscles locking like something had run current through them. The bottle slipped from fingers that had simply stopped working, fell in something that looked, to everyone watching, like slow motion, and hit the wooden floor hard enough to shatter. Beer spread across the boards in a widening gold stain, and Griffin didn't move, didn't even seem to notice. "Holy!" Reyes's voice broke off entirely. His phone clattered onto the table beside him. 22 years of special operations, missions in every dangerous corner of the world. And he looked, right now, like a man who'd just watched a ghost walk through the door he'd been standing beside all night. Foss's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide with a recognition that only came from classified briefings and need-to-know rooms most people never got invited into. Eli dropped the glass he'd been holding. It shattered on the floor behind the bar, and he didn't even glance down. Even Colonel Voss, a man who'd kept his composure through 2 decades of combat operations, visibly staggered a half-step backward. No. Sully Pruitt sank to his knees with the gracelessness of legs that had simply given out, his bloodshot eyes wide with something close to religious awe.
"You're the ghost you're supposed to be! Kowalski!"
Still fighting to get air back into his lungs on the floor, lifted his head. Even through the pain, the recognition on his face was unmistakable. In certain circles, in certain contracts signed in cash, certain names transcended ordinary reputation. They became legend. Cautionary tale. Benchmark. That's impossible. Voss's voice had lost all its earlier conviction. "You died." The whole unit was listed Kia. I read the after-action report myself. Admiral Doyle crossed the room. And then he did something that sent a second shockwave through Anchor Point, bigger than the first. He dropped to one knee in front of her. "Master Chief." His voice, thick with something he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. "I'm sorry. I am so sorry I didn't recognize you." The bar erupted. Phones that had been recording out of casual curiosity became, in that instant, the most important devices in the room. Every live stream that had gone up expecting a bar fight was now broadcasting something else entirely, something the internet would not stop talking about for days. Comment sections exploded in real time. Disbelief, Frantic searches for a name nobody outside a handful of classified rooms was supposed to know. Griffin's legs finally gave out beneath him. He sank onto the nearest stool, his massive frame suddenly, visibly deflated, beer soaking into his boots without his noticing. His mind struggled to reconcile the woman standing 3 feet away with whatever stories he'd absorbed secondhand, in briefings he'd barely paid attention to. Near the door, unnoticed in the chaos, a woman in a blazer had stopped halfway across the threshold, phone raised out of pure reporter's instinct. The U-turn 2 blocks back suddenly making a terrible kind of sense. Reagan Shaw lowered her phone an inch, looked again, looked harder, and felt the floor tilt beneath her. Because the woman kneeling admirals were apologizing to, the woman 5 Navy SEALs had just watched dismantle a Glock in 15 seconds flat. The woman the entire internet was about to learn the name of was wearing scrubs with a coffee stain on the sleeve that Reagan had teased her about over breakfast 3 days ago, was her sister. The bar around Delaney had become a roar of disbelief and recognition, of shattered glass and dropped phones and grown men going quiet in ways they hadn't gone quiet in years. She stood in the middle of it, water glass forgotten on the bar behind her, 10 years of careful, deliberate anonymity coming apart in real time under fluorescent light, and 100 camera lenses she hadn't invited. She had wanted, tonight, a beer she wasn't going to finish, and a stool where nobody talked to her. Instead, the whole world had just found Viper 1, and somewhere behind the crowd, close enough to see, close enough that their eyes would meet. In the next few seconds, her sister stood frozen at the door, phone still raised, already understanding was that nothing about their family was ever going to be quiet again. Delaney's gaze moved through the crowd. Griffin, pale and shrunken on his stool. Foss, tears she hadn't given herself permission to cry, yet standing bright in her eyes. Reyes, still holding his silent phone like it might explain something it couldn't. Voss, reassessing everything he thought he understood about the woman standing in front of him. And then, past all of them, near the door, Reagan. Their eyes met across the wreckage of the bar, across 10 years of careful lies told at Thanksgiving dinners and birthday calls, and every version of "I'm fine, just tired, hospital's been busy" that Delaney had ever offered instead of the truth. Reagan's mouth opened. No sound came out, because there weren't words yet for this. Not for the sister who'd spent a decade believing she understood exactly. Who Delaney Shaw was tired, steady, endlessly patient. A nurse who came home smelling like antiseptic and exhaustion and nothing else. Not for the woman standing in the wreckage of a bar fight with an admiral kneeling in front of her and a call sign hanging in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Somewhere outside, a second black SUV pulled into the lot. Then a third, headlights sweeping across the windows in slow arcs that caught Delaney's attention even through the chaos. Whatever machinery her 3 words had just set into motion, it was already moving faster than she could stop it. Admiral Doyle rose from his knee, his composure reassembling itself piece by piece, though his eyes hadn't fully recovered yet. He turned to address the room, and for a moment, the roar of phones and voices actually dimmed enough to hear him. What you're about to hear does not leave this room. Nobody in Anchor Point believed that for a second. The live streams were already broadcasting to thousands. Soon it would be more. But he said it anyway, because some rules existed, even when everyone in the room knew they were already broken. "Master Chief Delaney Shaw," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the name, like it cost him something to say it out loud after all these years. "Call sign Viper 1, the most decorated operator this command has ever produced, and until tonight, she has not officially existed for 10 years. The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it. Not shock this time, something closer to reverence. Understanding that they were standing in the presence of something most of them would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe to people who hadn't been there. Delaney stood very still in the middle of it, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, feeling the 10 careful years she'd built for herself come apart at the seams in real time. She looked like exactly what she'd pretended to be for a decade, a tired healthcare worker at the end of a brutal shift. Except now, Everyone in that bar could finally see what had been hiding in plain sight the whole time. The perfect balance beneath the exhaustion. The scars on her forearms that weren't from IV lines or med carts. The particular stillness of someone who had already seen the worst version of the world and chosen, deliberately, every single day since, to spend her life trying to heal instead of harm. Near the door, Reagan finally lowered her phone all the way. Started moving through the crowd toward her sister, pushing past shoulders and elbows, and the general chaos of a room that had just watched its entire understanding of a woman collapse and rebuild itself in under 4 minutes. Delaney, her voice, when it finally worked, came out smaller than she meant it to. What is happening? What is this? Who are you? Delaney turned to face her sister fully for the first time since she'd noticed her at the door. And for just a moment, standing in the wreckage of shattered glass and spilled beer and a decade of careful silence, she looked less like a legend and more like exactly what she still, underneath everything, actually was: somebody's sister. Somebody who'd been carrying something enormous, alone for far too long. "I can explain," Delaney said quietly. Her voice, for the first time all night, didn't sound steady at all. "I don't know if you're going to want to hear it, but I can explain." Behind them, Admiral Doyle's phone rang, sharp and sudden in the settling quiet. He answered it, listened for 3 seconds, and his expression, already stripped down by the last 5 minutes, went somewhere darker still. "Understood," he said. "Send the package." He ended the call and looked at Delaney the way a man looks at someone he's about to ask for something he has no right to ask for. "Master Chief." His voice had gone careful now, formal. The kind of formal that meant bad news was coming wrapped in rank and procedure, because that was easier than saying it plainly. "I need 5 minutes. Privately. It's important." Delaney felt something cold settle low in her stomach, a feeling she recognized from a decade ago and had hoped, foolishly, she would never have to feel again. Because good news didn't travel by black SUV. Good news didn't make an admiral run 200 yards from his car in civilian clothes at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Whatever this was, it had already started before she'd ever said her call sign out loud. She glanced once more at her sister, standing there with tears starting in her eyes and 100 unanswered questions crowding behind them, and felt the particular ache of a promise she was about to have to break twice in one night, once to Reagan, who deserved the truth she'd been denied for 10 years, and once to herself, to the quiet, ordinary life she'd built stitch by careful stitch out of night shifts and antiseptic, and the deliberate daily choice to be nobody in particular. "Give me a minute," she told Reagan, and reached out, briefly, to press her palm against her sister's cheek, the way she used to when they were kids and Reagan couldn't sleep. "I promise. I'll explain everything. Just give me a minute." Then she followed the Admiral toward the back of the bar, past Reyes still gripping his silent phone, past Foss, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, past Griffin staring at the floor, like it might offer him an explanation for how badly he'd misjudged the night. Outside, through the tinted windows, more vehicles were arriving. Whatever machine her 3 words had set into motion was already grinding forward. And some part of Delaney, the part that had spent 10 years believing she'd left this life behind for good, understood, with the particular clarity of dread, that this was only the beginning of whatever came next. She had wanted, tonight, a beer she wasn't going to finish, and a stool where nobody talked to her. Instead, she was about to find out exactly what Rear Admiral Patrick Doyle had run through a parking lot to tell her. And some small, old, buried part of her, the part that had survived 16 hours alone against odds no one should survive, already knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water, that, whatever it was going to cost her everything all over again. The back room of Anchor Point smelled like old cardboard and gun oil. A storage closet turned makeshift office where Eli kept his concealed carry paperwork, and a single flickering fluorescent tube that buzzed like it was trying to say something nobody wanted to hear. Admiral Doyle closed the door behind them. Didn't sit. Didn't offer her a chair either, because there wasn't one, just a folding table, and 2 crates of napkins and the particular silence of a man deciding how to say something that couldn't be said gently. 10 years, he said finally. 10 years I've lived with what happened to your team. And I told myself, every single one of those years, that the mercy in it was that you never had to see any of them again. Never had to watch the department close the file. Never had to sit through the memorial we held for people who thought you were dead too. Delaney folded her arms, waited, because she'd learned a long time ago that silence pulled truth out of people faster than questions ever did. Say it, she said. Cobb's out. 2 words. That was all it took for the room to tilt, because that name didn't belong in a back room in San Diego. That name belonged in a file drawer somewhere with a lid bolted shut. In a decade, she'd spent every single day trying to bury under hospital shifts and grocery runs, and the particular ordinariness of a life built specifically not to be noticed. Silas Cobb, the man who'd turned a routine hostage recovery into a slaughter, the man whose face she still saw sometimes in the half-second before waking, in that thin membrane between asleep and awake where the worst memories like to live. That's not possible. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was its own kind of skill, the same skill that had let her tie a tourniquet on herself 16 hours into the worst night of her life without her hands shaking once. He's serving consecutive federal sentences. 2 of them. He doesn't see daylight until. He escaped custody 9 days ago. Doyle's jaw worked like the words cost him something physical to release. Transport error. A contractor who shouldn't have been anywhere near that convoy. We've been trying to run this quiet, trying to bring him back in before it became a headline, before it became your problem again. Except he's not hiding. Doyle's eyes wouldn't quite hold hers now. He's building, recruiting. And 2 days ago, he sent a message, not to the Bureau, not to us. She already knew. Some cold animal part of her already knew before he said it. The way you know a storm's coming from the particular color the sky goes right before it breaks. He's got Des. The name hit her like something physical, like a hand closing around a wrist she thought had healed a long time ago. Because Des Calloway wasn't just a name in an old file to her. Des Calloway was the reason she still believed 16 hours of hell had meant something. Des Calloway was 24 years old the last time she'd seen him, terrified, bleeding from a graze wound along his ribs, his older sister Marnie half carrying him toward the its extraction point, while Delaney walked backward behind them, weapon up, buying seconds with her own body, because that's what the job had asked of her, and she'd said yes. He'd be 34 now, 10 years older, 10 years free, until 9 days ago apparently, when a man who should have rotted in a federal cell decided the story wasn't finished. Where? We don't have a location yet. Cobb's smart. He's had a decade to plan this, and he's not going to make it easy. Doyle finally met her eyes fully, and what was in them wasn't command anymore. It was something closer to plea. But he sent proof of life, and a message. 2 words, say them, Viper 1. The fluorescent tube overhead buzzed and flickered once, and for a half-second the little room went dim. And in that half-second, Delaney felt every one of the 16 hours she'd spent alone in a burning building, a decade ago, rise up in her chest all at once. Unasked, unwelcome, exact, because she remembered the smell of scorched drywall. Because she remembered the particular sounds 5 heartbeats make when they stop, one after another, over a radio channel that never should have gone that quiet. Because she remembered promising a terrified 24-year-old kid that she would get him out, and somehow, impossibly she had. And now, the man who'd taken everything from her that night wanted her back, wanted a rematch. He thought he'd earned simply by surviving long enough to demand one. 72 hours, Doyle said quietly. That's the window. After that, he said he'll release proof that Des didn't survive it. And knowing Cobb, that won't just be a statement to a camera. Delaney closed her eyes, just for a second, long enough to feel the weight of it settle fully into her chest, and then long enough to set that weight down somewhere she could carry it without it showing on her face. I need everything you have, she said, opening her eyes. Every scrap, every intercept, every guess your analysts have made and been too scared to say out loud. You don't have to do this alone. I've done everything alone for 10 years, Admiral. Her voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. That's not going to change tonight, just because 100 people watched me say 3 words in a bar. But even as she said it, some quiet, honest part of her already knew that wasn't entirely true anymore. Because the moment she'd said Viper 1 out loud, the moment Griffin's beer bottle hit the floor, and Reyes's phone clattered off the table, something had shifted that she couldn't put back the way it had been. 10 years of invisibility, gone in under 4 minutes. And waiting for her on the other side of that door was a sister who deserved an explanation Delaney had never once let herself imagine giving. Reagan was standing exactly where Delaney had left her, arms wrapped around herself like she was cold, though the bar was warm enough. Though the only cold thing in the room was the particular chill of finding out you never actually knew someone you thought you knew completely. "You have 5 minutes," Reagan said, before Delaney had even fully stepped through the door. 5 minutes, Delaney. That's what you gave me, and it's been closer to 15. I know. Do you? Reagan's voice cracked right down the middle, half anger, half something rawer underneath it. Because I've spent 10 years asking you why you never date anyone, why you flinch at fireworks, why you sat with your back to the wall at my wedding, at Mom's funeral, at literally every dinner we've ever had together, and every single time. You said the same thing. Ex, boyfriend, issues. You said it like a joke, Delaney. Like it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. No kidding. Reagan let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Wasn't quite anything else either. An admiral just knelt in front of you. Do you understand how that looks from where I'm standing? Do you understand what people are going to say when this footage? It's already online. Delaney said it flatly. Not because she didn't care. Because caring wouldn't undo it. There's nothing I can do about that now. Reagan's eyes went wide, then narrow, then wide again, cycling through something that looked like grief trying to find a shape to settle into. 10 years. Her voice had dropped now, quieter, which somehow made it worse. 10 years I thought you were just tired. Quiet. I thought that's who you were. And the whole time you were, she stopped, started again. What even are you, Delaney? Who am I actually related to? Your sister. Delaney reached for her hand, and for one terrible second thought Reagan might pull away. She didn't. That part was never a lie. Everything else, the timing, the reasons, all of it I can explain. I want to explain, but not here. Not with 40 phones still recording. Because that was true too. Half the bar was still filming, even now, even with nothing left to film. But 2 sisters standing close together, looking like their whole world had just cracked down the middle. Reagan looked past her, toward the back room Delaney had just come out of, toward the admiral standing near the doorway, with a phone pressed to his ear, and an expression that had gone somewhere grim while nobody was watching. "Something's wrong," Reagan said. Not a question. Reporter's instinct, the same one that had turned her car around 2 blocks early tonight, picking up on something before the words had even been said out loud. Something happened in there. What? Delaney didn't answer right away. Because how did you explain, in the middle of a bar, in front of a sister who just learned her entire understanding of you, was built on a decade of careful omission, that the story wasn't finished? That the worst night of your life had just reopened its door and was standing there, waiting, with a clock running? "I have to go somewhere," Delaney said finally. "Tonight. And I don't know how long I'll be gone, and I can't tell you where, and I know exactly how unfair that is to ask of you right now. Don't." Reagan's voice broke properly this time. "Don't you dare walk away from me again. Not after this. Not after tonight. I'm not walking away." Delaney pulled her sister into a hug, fierce and sudden, the kind she hadn't let herself give in years because it always felt like giving away too much. "I'm walking towards something I have to fix. There's a difference. I promise you there's a difference." Reagan held on tighter than either of them expected, and for just a moment, standing there in the wreckage of spilled beer and shattered glass, and 100 strangers' phones still trained on them, they were just sisters again. Not Viper 1 and a reporter. Not a legend and a stranger. Just Delaney and Reagan, the way they'd been since they were kids sharing a bedroom in a house that never had quite enough heat in the winter. When this is over, Reagan whispered into her shoulder, you're going to tell me everything. When this is over, Delaney said, I will. She just didn't say out loud what she was thinking underneath it. That she didn't actually know. Standing in that bar with 71 hours and change left on a clock that had started. The moment Admiral Doyle walked through that door, weather over was a thing that was guaranteed to come. They regrouped at a hangar on the edge of the base. An hour later, the kind of building that existed on no public map, windows blacked out, guarded by 2 men who checked IDs against a list that had exactly 9 names on it. Delaney's name was already on it, had been, apparently, for 10 years waiting. Inside, folding tables had been pushed together under harsh overhead lights, and satellite images were already scrolling across a laptop screen that Master Chief Reyes had commandeered before anyone even asked him to. He hadn't gone home to change. Neither had Griffin, still in the same shirt with the beer stain drying stiff across the front of it, standing now with none of the swagger he'd walked into Anchor Point with 3 hours ago. Foss sat across from him, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching Delaney the way you watch someone you'd underestimated so completely that the correction felt almost physically painful. 12 years I've been doing this job, Foss said quietly, not quite meeting Delaney's eyes. And I called you a liar in front of a bar full of people. You didn't know. That's not an excuse. Foss's voice hardened, but not at Delaney, at herself. I looked at you and saw a nurse who got a lucky hit in. I should have looked harder. You're looking now. Delaney's voice was steady, the tone she used with terrified families in the ER when the news wasn't good, but panic wouldn't help anybody survive it. That's what matters tonight. Reyes cleared his throat, tapped the laptop screen. Cobb's proof of life video came in through a burner account 2 days ago. Analysts traced the upload to a relay server bouncing through 6 different countries before it dead-ended in Nevada. He's not stupid. Whatever facility he's using, he picked it because it's hard to find. Show me. The video was 11 seconds long. Des Calloway, older than she remembered. A decade's worth of years carved into a face she'd last seen young, and terrified and streaked with someone else's blood. He sat in a chair, hands bound, a wall of unfinished plywood behind him that told her nothing except that wherever he was, it wasn't finished being built into whatever it was going to become. Viper 1, Des said into the camera, his voice flat, coached, obviously reading from something just off frame. He says you'll know what this means. The video ended. The room stayed silent for a long moment after, because 11 seconds. That was all Cobb had needed to send in order to reopen a wound Delaney had spent 10 years learning to live around. I know exactly what it means, she said finally. It means he's been planning this since the day he went into custody. It means 72 hours was never really 72 hours. It means every hour we spend confirming things he already knows will confirm is an hour he's using to prepare for exactly this. Then we move fast. Griffin spoke up for the first time since the hangar, his voice rougher than it had been in the bar, stripped of every ounce of performance. I want in. Delaney looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't bothered to in the bar, when he was just another loud man in a blue shirt, taking up space he hadn't earned yet. You don't owe me anything, Griffin. I dumped a beer on you and called you a tourist in your own bar. His jaw tightened. Then I watched a man I respect kneel down and apologize to you for a decade of not knowing you existed. I owe you the chance to say no. But I'm still asking. Foss raised her hand slightly, not quite a salute. Something more personal than that. Same. Reyes didn't even bother asking permission. He just kept working the laptop, pulling up satellite overlays, cross-referencing property records against known associates from Cobb's file. The particular focus of a man who'd decided somewhere in the last hour that this wasn't a debate anymore. I know people, he said without looking up. People who owe favors from the old days. People who've been waiting a long time for a chance to do something about what happened to your team. Delaney felt something tighten in her chest, something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite fear. Some third thing that lived in the narrow space between the two. Because she'd spent 10 years convincing herself that surviving alone was the price she'd agreed to pay. that nobody else needed to bleed for a mistake that had already cost her everything once. And here they were, 3 people who'd known her for exactly one catastrophic evening, already rearranging their lives around a fight that wasn't theirs. "This isn't your war," she said quietly. "With respect, Master Chief." Reyes finally looked up from the screen, and there was something old and steady in his eyes, something that had clearly been waiting a long time to be said. "You made it ours the second you walked back into that hospital 10 years ago, instead of letting the world know what you did. You could have taken the medals, the parade, the book deal, probably. Instead, you disappeared and spent a decade patching up strangers in an ER because you didn't know how to be anything except somebody who saves people. That's not something we get to sit out on. Not when we finally know." Delaney didn't have an answer for that. Not one she trusted her voice to deliver without cracking. Near midnight, a 4th figure walked into the hangar, and the temperature in the room dropped by several degrees before he'd even said a word. Nate Kowalski moved like a man who'd spent a career being paid to make people uncomfortable, wide shoulders rolling with each step, his expression doing an approximation of concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Heard you're putting together a team," he said, addressing Reyes but watching Delaney. "I want in. You tried to grab me in a bar 3 hours ago," Delaney said flatly, "and you put me on the floor gasping like a fish." He almost smiled. "Almost. I respect that. More than I respect most people I meet in bars. I've done 6 tours as a contractor. I know facilities like whatever Cobb's building. I know how these networks move money, how they move people. You need someone who's been inside operations like this from the other side." Reyes's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue, because Kowalski wasn't wrong, and time was the one resource none of them had enough of. "We could use the expertise," Reyes admitted, reluctant. "But he watches him close," he added quietly to Delaney, once Kowalski had crossed the hangar to look over the satellite images himself. "That kind of experience doesn't always come from the side of the fence we'd like." Delaney watched Kowalski lean over the table, watched the particular way his eyes moved across the property records Reyes had pulled up, not curious, not searching, cataloging, filing something away for later use, though later use for what, she couldn't yet say. Some old instinct, the same one that had kept her alive for 16 hours a decade ago, whispered caution. She filed it away too. There wasn't time tonight to chase every shadow. There was only time to move. "Fine," she said. "You're in. But you work under Reyes. Every step." Kowalski spread his hands. Easy, agreeable. Wouldn't have it any other way. By 2 in the morning, the hangar had transformed into something closer to a command center. Laptops humming, satellite imagery pinned across a corkboard someone had dragged out of a supply closet, a dry erase timeline chalked across a whiteboard that read 72 hours at the top, in letters that had already started to feel like a countdown ticking somewhere behind everyone's ribs. Delaney stood at the center of it, not because she'd claimed that position, but because the room had simply arranged itself around her the way iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet, without anyone quite deciding to do it. Because that's what command looked like, she realized somewhere in the 4th hour of planning. Not the medals. Not the call sign whispered in awe. Just this, a room full of people who'd decided, independently, that whatever she said next was worth doing. "Talk to me about the facility," she said, pulling Reyes's chair around so she could study the overlay herself. "Best guess, based on the video's background and the relay pattern, we're looking at somewhere in rural Nevada. Old industrial site. Possibly a decommissioned processing plant." Reyes traced a finger across the screen. "Isolated. Hard to approach without being seen for miles. If Cobb picked it, he picked it for exactly that reason." "How many people does he have with him?" "Unknown. Analysts estimate somewhere between 8 and 15, based on chatter we've picked up through informants in the network he's been rebuilding. Mix of true believers and paid muscle." Reyes's jaw tightened. "He's not running this like a desperate man hiding from federal marshals, Delaney. He's running it like a man building an army." Foss leaned forward, arms braced on the table. Which means this isn't just about getting Des back. If Cobb's rebuilding something, this ends with him neutralized. Otherwise, we're back here in another 10 years having this same conversation. Agreed. Delaney's voice had gone flat and clear, the particular tone that came from a decade-old habit of making decisions when other people's lives depended on getting them right the first time. But Des comes first. Every plan, every contingency, every single decision we make from this point forward goes through one filter. Does it get him out alive? If the answer's no, we don't do it, no matter how tactically clean it looks on paper. Griffin nodded slowly. Copy that. There's something else. Reyes hesitated, and the hesitation itself was enough to make the room go quiet. The message Cobb sent. Viper 1. He's not just calling you out to trade a hostage, he's inviting you specifically. Which means whatever he's planning, it's built around you showing up in person. I know. That's a trap, Delaney. Foss's voice sharpened. You walk in there alone, and it doesn't matter how good you are. Numbers eventually win. I know that too. Delaney's eyes didn't leave the satellite image, tracing the outline of the compound like she could already see the angles. Already feel the weight of the ground beneath her boots, even though she hadn't been within 500 miles of it yet. Which is why I'm not walking in alone. I'm walking in exactly the way he expects. And everyone else is going to be somewhere he doesn't expect at all. Something shifted in the room. Not doubt, exactly. Something closer to recognition. The particular feeling of watching a plan take shape that was going to work, precisely because it was terrifying enough that only someone who'd already survived the worst night imaginable would have the nerve to propose it. Dawn found Delaney outside the hangar, sitting on the hood of her 10-year-old sedan, a cup of gas station coffee going cold in her hands, watching the sky over the base turn the particular gray-gold color that meant the sun hadn't fully decided yet whether the day was going to be kind. Her phone buzzed. Reagan. She almost let it go to voicemail. Didn't? Hey, you didn't come home? Reagan's voice, thick with the particular exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept either. I sat up all night waiting, and you didn't come home, and I kept refreshing that stupid video, and it's got 2 million views now, Delaney. 2 million. People are calling you a hero online. Other people are calling the whole thing staged. Nobody knows what to believe, and I'm sitting here and I don't know what to believe either, because you're my sister and I don't even know your real job. My real job is saving lives in an ER. That part was never fake. Delaney closed her eyes, listening to the bass slowly waking up around her, trucks starting, distant voices calling across the tarmac. The rest of it, that was a long time ago. I thought it was over. I thought I'd left it behind for good. But it's not over. It wasn't a question. No, Delaney admitted. It's not. Silence stretched between them, staticky and long, the kind of silence that usually meant a call was about to end badly. Is this dangerous? Reagan asked finally, her reporter's voice slipping for just a second into something smaller, something that sounded exactly like the little sister who used to climb into Delaney's bed during thunderstorms. What you're about to do. Is it dangerous? Delaney thought about lying. Thought about it seriously, weighed the mercy of it against the cost, and decided, for the first time in a decade, that Reagan deserved better than another careful omission dressed up as kindness. Yes, she said, it's dangerous. She heard Reagan take a shaky breath on the other end of the line. Then come back, Reagan whispered. Whatever this is, whoever you have to be to finish it, just come back, please. I just found you again. I'm not ready to lose you before I even understand who you actually are. I'm going to try. It was the only promise Delaney had ever learned not to make lightly, because she'd broken enough of them a decade ago, watching 5 names go quiet over a radio channel that should never have gone that silent. That's all I can give you right now. I'm going to try, and I'm going to fight harder than I've fought for anything in 10 years, because somebody's counting on me the exact same way 73 people counted on me once before, and I got every single one of them home. 73? Reagan's voice cracked on the number, disbelief and something like awe tangled together. Delaney, what happened to you 10 years ago? Delaney looked out across the tarmac, watching the sun finally decide. breaking gold and clean over the hangar roofline, chasing the gray out of the sky 1 degree at a time. "When this is over," she said quietly, "I'll tell you everything. I promise. But right now, I need you to trust me. Just for a little while longer." Another long pause. And then, quieter, steadier. Something that sounded almost like their mother's voice threading through it. The particular stubborn love that ran through both of them like a seam of iron. "Okay?" Reagan's voice had found its footing again. "Okay, I trust you. Go save whoever you have to save. But you come back and tell me everything, Delaney Shaw. Every single word of it." "I will." She ended the call and sat there for another moment, coffee gone cold in her hands, watching the base come fully awake around her, and let herself feel, just for a second, the particular ache of loving someone enough to risk breaking her heart twice in one lifetime. Then she stood, poured the coffee out onto the gravel, and walked back into the hangar, where a countdown was still running, where a room full of people who'd known her for less than 12 hours were already rearranging their entire lives to help her keep a promise she'd made to a terrified 24-year-old a decade ago. By mid-morning, the plan had a shape. Rough, dangerous. The kind of plan that would have made every tactics instructor Delaney had ever trained under lose several years off their life just looking at it. But it had a shape. And a shape was more than they'd had 6 hours ago. "Walk me through it again," Voss said, arriving mid-morning still in the same uniform from the night before, dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept either. Command had a way of following people home even when they desperately needed it not to. "I go in first. Alone. Exactly like Cobb wants." Delaney traced the route across the satellite overlay, her fingers steady despite the weight of what she was describing. "He's been planning around the assumption that I'll come in reckless. Driven by guilt, willing to trade myself straight across for Dez. I'm going to give him exactly that performance. And the rest of us? Positioned here, here, and here." Reyes tapped 3 points along the compound's perimeter, chosen with the particular care of a man who'd spent decades reading terrain like other people read faces. "High ground, concealed approach. We move in the moment Delaney creates an opening." "What kind of opening?" Voss asked. Delaney's jaw tightened, the memory of a similar moment a decade ago, rising unbidden, sharp enough to taste. "The kind that buys seconds. That's all I need from anyone. Seconds." Kowalski, leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed, spoke up for the first time in an hour. "You're going to get yourself killed walking in there solo. I've seen compounds like this. Cobb's not going to play fair just because you show up unarmed and cooperative." "I never said unarmed." Something flickered behind Delaney's eyes, quiet and dangerous. "I said exactly what he expects." "Those aren't the same thing." Kowalski held her gaze a beat too long before looking away, and something about the exchange left an itch at the back of Delaney's mind that she filed away again. The same instinct from the hangar the night before, still unresolved, still quietly insisting something wasn't right. There wasn't time to chase it. "Not yet. We move at first light tomorrow," she said instead, straightening, looking around the room at the faces that had, impossibly, become something like a team in the span of a single sleepless night. "Every one of you needs to understand what you're walking into. This isn't a training exercise. Cobb doesn't take prisoners he doesn't need. And right now, the only prisoner he needs is Dez, which means the rest of us are expendable to him the second we're spotted." Nobody in the room flinched. Nobody looked away. "Then let's make sure we're not spotted," Griffin said quietly, and something in his voice had changed completely from the man who'd dumped a beer on her 12 hours earlier. Some final layer of swagger burned away entirely, leaving behind something steadier, something worth trusting. That evening, Delaney found herself outside the hangar again, this time with Nina, who'd tracked her down through 3 phone calls, and a text that simply read, "Where are you? I'm not asking twice." Nina leaned against the sedan, arms crossed, studying Delaney with the particular unflinching honesty of somebody who'd spent 2 years watching her handle other people's worst days without ever once asking about her own. "You're leaving," Nina said. "Not a question. For a while. The hospital's going to notice." "I know." Delaney managed something close to a smile, tired and small. Tell them I had a family emergency. It's not even entirely a lie. Nina studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression softened into worry she wasn't bothering to hide anymore. Whatever this is, whoever you actually are underneath all those double shifts, and the way you always know exactly what to say to a terrified family in the worst moment of their lives. She shook her head slowly. I should have figured it out years ago. Nobody's that calm by accident. I wasn't always calm. Delaney's voice went quiet, distant, somewhere back in a burning building a decade in the past. I learned it. The same way anybody learns anything. Slowly, painfully, by having no other choice. Nina reached out and squeezed her hand, brief and fierce. Come back in one piece, Delaney Shaw. I've got a shift schedule that falls apart completely without you on it, and frankly, I don't know how to run a code without you barking orders over my shoulder. I'll be back. Delaney squeezed back. I've got 73 reasons to come back from things like this. What's one more? She didn't explain the number. Nina didn't ask. Some things, she'd learned, you simply had to trust, even when the shape of the truth stayed hidden a little while longer. Night fell over the base, and one by one, the volunteers who'd be walking into Nevada with her at dawn found their own quiet moments before the storm. Griffin calling his mother, voice low, saying nothing about where he was going, only that he loved her, which was, Delaney thought, watching from a distance, its own kind of confession. Foss sitting alone with a photograph of a young girl, 7 or 8, tucked into the corner of a laptop screen, whispering something too quiet to carry. Reyes running through weapons checks with the particular methodical calm of a man who'd done this exact ritual more times than he could count. Each check a small private prayer disguised as procedure. And Kowalski, standing apart from all of it, phone pressed to his ear, voice low, his back turned toward the rest of the hangar in a way that might have meant nothing at all. Delaney watched him from across the room a moment too long, watched the particular tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked once toward the group, before he lowered his voice further, and turned fully away. Some old, careful part of her filed it away one more time, sharper now, less easy to dismiss. Trust nobody completely, she reminded herself. Not even the people standing beside you. Especially not the ones you haven't earned the right to trust yet. She didn't say anything. Not yet. There wasn't proof. There was only instinct. And instinct alone had never once been enough to justify tearing a team apart the night before a mission that had already run out of room for error. But she watched. And she remembered. At midnight, with 6 hours left before departure, Delaney sat alone in the corner of the hangar with the satellite image spread across her lap, tracing the compound's outline over and over until the shape of it lived behind her eyelids even when she closed them. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Reagan. No words. Just a photograph, the two of them, maybe 8 years old and 12, sitting on a porch step somewhere in a childhood. That felt like it belonged to two entirely different women now. Underneath it, 3 words. Come home safe. Delaney stared at the photograph for a long moment, feeling the particular ache of every promise she'd ever made and every one she'd ever had to break, and then set the phone face down beside her, the same way she had in the bar the night before, back when the only thing she'd wanted from the evening was a beer she wasn't going to finish, and a little bit of quiet. The quiet was gone now, had been gone since the moment 3 words left her mouth and changed the shape of everything. Somewhere in Nevada, a man who should have died in her memory a decade ago was waiting behind unfinished plywood walls with a countdown of his own running, certain he already understood exactly who was coming for him. He didn't. Not really. He remembered the woman who'd nearly died getting 73 strangers out of a burning building. He had no idea what that woman had built herself into in the 10 years since. No idea that the quiet, careful air nurse who'd spent a decade healing instead of hunting had never once stopped being exactly what she was the night she earned that call sign in blood and smoke and 16 desperate hours. Delaney closed her eyes, and for the first time since walking into Anchor Point, wanting nothing more than an hour of peace, let herself feel something close to certainty. Cobb thought he was calling Viper 1 out of hiding. What he was actually about to meet was everything that decade of hiding had quietly, patiently built. She checked her watch. 5 hours and 40 minutes until departure. Outside, the hangar door stood open to a sky full of hard, cold stars, and somewhere beneath them, in a rented compound in the Nevada desert, a boy she'd once carried 200 yards under gunfire waited for a promise she intended, with everything left in her, to keep. The desert didn't wake up gently. It came up gray and then bruised purple and then, all at once, gold. The sun cresting the ridgeline like something that had waited all night just to see what would happen next. Delaney stood at the tailgate of a nondescript panel van parked 2 miles out from the compound, checking gear that didn't need checking because her hands needed something to do besides shake. They didn't shake. They never did. But the ritual of checking helped anyway, because rituals were how you survived the hour before. You checked the straps. You checked the mag. You checked the small circular scar on your own wrist, the one Wade Griffin's hand had landed on 3 nights ago without knowing what it meant. And you let yourself remember, for exactly 1 breath, why you were here. Then you put it away, because there wasn't room for memory where she was about to walk. Comms check. Race's voice, low and empty in her earpiece, cut through the ritual and brought her fully into the present. 5 by 5, she answered. Around her, the team moved with the particular economy of people who'd spent the entire night rehearsing a plan none of them had said out loud might not work. Griffin double-checked his rifle's 0 one more time, jaw tight, none of the swagger left in him now. Foss knelt beside a case of gear, hands steady, though Delaney had caught her, 20 minutes earlier, sitting alone with that same photograph glowing on her phone screen, the little girl with gap teeth and a gap in her front smile. A whole life Foss was risking today for a woman she'd called a liar 3 days ago. Reyes stood a little apart, studying the compound through a spotting scope, his face unreadable, though something in the set of his shoulders told Delaney he was carrying more weight than he'd let on. 22 years, and this was still the part that never got easier. The morning of. And Kowalski. Kowalski stood near the front of the van, phone in hand, thumb moving fast across the screen, texting. At 6 in the morning, 2 hours before a mission that was supposed to demand absolute radio silence from every single person involved. Delaney watched him a beat too long, because that itch from the hangar 3 nights ago hadn't gone away. If anything, it had gotten louder. A low, persistent hum at the back of her skull that refused to be filed away and forgotten no matter how many times she tried. "Everything okay?" she asked, keeping her voice light, testing. Kowalski's thumb stopped moving. He looked up, and for exactly half a second, so fast most people would have missed it entirely, something flickered behind his eyes. Guilt. She knew that expression. She'd seen it on 1,000 faces in the ER. The particular look of somebody who'd done something they couldn't undo and hadn't yet found the courage to say so. "Checking on my kid," he said, sliding the phone into his pocket. "Custody weekend. She worries when I go dark." It was a good lie. Smooth. Plausible. The kind of lie built by somebody who'd had years of practice constructing exactly this shape of story. Except Kowalski didn't have a kid. Delaney had read his file twice last night, while everyone else slept. Memorized every line of it the way she used to memorize terrain before an insertion, and there had been nothing in it. No custody arrangement. No daughter waiting on the other end of a worried text. She said nothing, filed it away. One more piece in a puzzle she didn't have time to finish solving before the sun climbed any higher. "Wheels up in 10, Reyes called, and the moment passed, swallowed by motion, by gear settling into place, by the particular silence that falls over a team in the last minutes before everything either goes exactly to plan or doesn't. The compound sat low and ugly against the desert floor, a converted processing plant ringed by chain link and razor wire that had gone up sometime in the last 2 weeks, still bright and unrusted, still smelling faintly of fresh-cut metal even from the ridge where Griffin and Foss lay prone, scopes trained on the yard below. Cobb had built this fast. Built it like a man who'd had 10 years in a cell to plan every detail, and finally, the resources to make it real. Delaney studied it through her own scope from a quarter-mile out, cataloging everything with the particular cold clarity that had kept her alive once before in a building not unlike this one. 2 guard towers, hasty construction, plywood and scaffolding rather than anything permanent. 6 visible sentries walking the perimeter in a pattern that repeated every 11 minutes. A single vehicle gate on the north side, wide enough for a truck, narrow enough to bottleneck anyone trying to force their way through. And near the center of the compound, a low concrete building with reinforced windows. The only structure on the property that looked like it predated Cobb's arrival by decades. That was where they'd find Des. She was almost certain of it. The kind of certain that came less from evidence and more from having spent 16 hours once learning exactly how men like Cobb thought. Exactly where they hid the things that mattered most to them. "I'm going in," she said into comms, low and final. "Copy." Reyes's voice carried none of the argument from 3 nights ago. They'd said everything that needed saying already, in the hangar, in the long hours of planning. Now there was only the plan, and the plan required her to walk. She left the rifle in the van, left the tactical vest, the radio, everything that would announce her as anything other than exactly what Cobb expected a woman walking alone across open ground, driven by guilt and grief and 10 years of unfinished business, unarmed by any reasonable measure. Except that wasn't entirely true, and both she and the team knew it, because a folding knife rode along her spine beneath her shirt, small enough to miss in a pat-down if the pat-down was hurried, and a compact pistol sat holstered against the small of her back, hidden beneath the loose fall of fabric. Small mercies. Small deceptions. The kind that had kept her alive before she started walking. The morning sun climbed higher with every step, throwing her shadow long and thin across the cracked earth, and somewhere behind her, 12 people she'd known for exactly 3 days held their breath and watched through scopes and waited for a signal that might never come. Because that's what this had become for me, she thought, and immediately caught the thought, hated the thought, shoved it down hard. Not me, not now. Focus on the walk. Focus on the ground. Focus on getting close enough that seconds would matter. The Taliban fighters saw her coming. No, wrong memory, wrong decade. She caught herself, breathed, corrected. Cobb's men saw her coming from half a mile out, and radios crackled to life along the perimeter. Urgent chatter in a language of static and half-words that carried clear across the still desert air even without a receiver to translate it. By the time she reached the outer fence line, a dozen armed men had gathered at the gate, weapons raised, faces hard with the particular readiness of people who'd been told, repeatedly, exactly who was coming and exactly how dangerous she was supposed to be. One of them stepped forward. Broad, scarred along one side of his jaw, eyes that had the flat, patient quality of somebody who'd been waiting a very long time for this specific morning. Viper 1. He said it like a title, like a trophy he'd already decided belonged to him. "You got my invitation. I'm here for Des." Her voice carried flat, and even across the open ground. "Let the others go. You want me. You've always wanted me. That's the only deal on the table." Silas Cobb laughed, a dry sound that cracked at the edges like something that hadn't been used properly in years. "You think you have leverage, walking into my house with nothing, making demands." He gestured, and more men appeared along the fence line, weapons rising with them. "You'll watch him die. Slowly, starting the moment you get close enough to see his face. 17 seconds. The words came out quiet, almost conversational. Cobb's expression flickered, confusion cutting briefly through the certainty he'd been wearing like armor. "What?" "That's how long you have to reconsider." Delaney's voice never wavered, never climbed. 17. 16. "You're bluffing." But something in his face had already started to crack. Some old memory surfacing of a woman who'd once held a burning building alone for 16 hours, against odds that should have killed her 20 times over. 15. 14. Cobb raised his rifle, leveling it at her face, close enough now that she could see his finger tighten against the trigger guard. Around the compound, 100 feet of chain link and razor wire away, a dozen more men mirrored the motion, weapons rising in unison. waiting for a single word to turn this morning into a massacre. 13, 12. Because that's what the countdown had always been, she realized, standing there with a rifle inches from her face and her own pulse steady as still water. Not a threat. A promise. A signal disguised as bravado. Timed to a plan 12 people had spent 3 sleepless nights building around exactly this moment. 11. 10. High above, on the ridge a quarter-mile out, Griffin's finger found the trigger, breath held. Crosshairs settled dead center on Cobb's skull, waiting for a mark that hadn't come yet but would. 9. 8. Cobb's finger moved a fraction against the trigger. Rage and confusion tangling together into something reckless. 7. 6. In Delaney's earpiece, silent to everyone but her, Reyes's voice came through low and even. All teams stand by on Viper's mark. 5. 4. Cobb's face had gone somewhere past confusion now, into something closer to fear. Though he wouldn't have called it that himself, wouldn't have had the vocabulary for it after 10 years of building himself into somebody who didn't feel fear anymore. 3, 2, 1. The world came apart in controlled chaos. Griffin's shot took Cobb before the word had fully left Delaney's mouth, the round finding its mark with a precision that ended everything Cobb had spent 10 years building in less time than it took to finish a sentence. Simultaneously, gunfire erupted from the ridge, from the tree line, from 3 positions Cobb's men had never thought to watch, because Cobb himself had told them, with absolute certainty, that the only threat coming today would walk through the front gate alone. He'd been wrong about that in every way that mattered. Delaney moved the instant Griffin's shot cracked across the desert air, dropping low, rolling right, her hand finding the pistol at the small of her back before her body had even finished processing the motion. 2 shots, 2 men down, the economy of movement that had made her legendary a decade ago returning to her body like it had never left. The compound's outer security collapsed within seconds, men falling before they could fully process what was happening. Their carefully constructed fortress transformed in an instant from a stronghold into a kill box, every position they'd chosen to keep intruders out now, serving perfectly to funnel them into fields of fire rays. Had spent 3 days mapping from every conceivable angle. She was already moving through the gate, past fallen bodies, past the chaos, her mental map of the compound guiding her toward the low concrete building at the center, like a compass needle, finding true north. Because somewhere in the noise and smoke, a boy she'd carried 200 yards under gunfire a decade ago was waiting, and this time she intended to finish the promise properly, cleanly, without the cost that had followed her home the first time. She found the door, kicked it, found 3 men inside, weapons raised, and dropped all 3 before any of them managed to pull a trigger, her movements so fast and so certain that later, when Foss reviewed the compound's own security footage during the debrief, she would watch the sequence 4 times before she fully believed what she was seeing. And then, in the back corner of the room, chained to a support beam, blinking against the sudden light, Des older, harder around the eyes than the terrified 24-year-old she remembered. But unmistakably him, and the moment his eyes found her face, something broke open in his expression that had nothing to do with fear at all. Viper. His voice cracked on the word. They said you were dead. They kept saying you were dead. I told you I'd come back if you ever needed me. She was already at the chains, working the lock with a small pick from her boot, hands steady despite everything. Can you walk? I can run if I have to. Good. The lock gave. Dez's hands came free, and for a fraction of a second he just stared at them like he didn't quite believe they belonged to him anymore. Because we're about to. Outside, the fighting had shifted from chaos into something more controlled. Reyes's voice calling positions over comms, with the particular calm of a man who'd done this exact work more times than he could count, though never quite like this, never with this much personally on the line. They reached the extraction point 3 minutes later, a flat stretch of desert where a helicopter Voss had authorized off. The books sat waiting, rotors already spinning, kicking up a storm of dust and grit. Des climbed aboard first, and Delaney did a head out of pure old instinct, an old habit from a decade ago that had never quite let go of her. One. That was all there'd been to save this time, and one was accounted for, safe, breathing, alive. But as she turned to follow him aboard, movement in her peripheral vision made her freeze. A young man, barely into his 20s, stumbled out from behind a stack of shipping containers near the fence line. Blood streaked one side of his face from a graze wound along his temple. His hands shook as he raised a rifle, the barrel wavering unsteadily between Delaney and the helicopter full of people he'd apparently been paid, or promised, or threatened into helping guard. Time did the thing it always did in moments like this. Slowed down, stretched out, gave her more room to think than should have been physically possible in the half-second available. She could draw and fire before he steadied his aim. Every instinct, every hour of training across 2 decades screamed at her to do exactly that, to eliminate the threat the way she'd been trained to eliminate threats since she was 19 years old. Except there was something in his eyes that stopped her hand cold. Not hatred, not conviction, just fear, raw and young and completely out of his depth. The exact same fear she remembered seeing in Des' eyes a decade ago, in a different building, in a different, desperate morning. Behind her, she felt her team's tension ripple through the air, weapons tracking the young man, waiting on her word to end it. She lowered her weapon instead. "Go home," she said, quiet, steady, the words carrying across the open ground between them. "Whatever they told you, whatever they paid you, it isn't worth what happens if you pull that trigger. Go home." The young man's finger trembled against the trigger guard. For an endless moment, the whole compound seemed to hold its breath around the two of them. A legendary operator and a terrified kid, weapons lowered between them, separated by 20 feet and an entire lifetime of different choices that had led them each to this exact patch of desert. Then his weapon dropped, clattering against the dirt. He turned and ran, disappearing between the containers, and nobody on Delaney's team fired a single shot. "Mount up," Reyes called over comms, and Delaney turned toward the helicopter, where her team stood watching her with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something that looked, unmistakably, like respect. Griffin extended a hand, pulling her aboard as the rotors spun faster, and as they lifted off the ground, Delaney looked back once at the compound below, smoke rising from scattered fires. Cobb's decade of planning ending in less time than it took most people to finish breakfast, and felt something inside her chest finally, quietly, settle. No casualties on their side. One person saved. The ghost of a decade-old nightmare finally, properly put to rest. The flight back to base passed mostly in silence, broken only by the steady thrum of rotors, and once, by Des's hand, finding Delaney's and gripping it with the same fierce trust he'd shown as a terrified young man being carried across open ground a decade earlier. Their positions had reversed completely. He was the one offering comfort now, some instinct in him sensing the weight of what she just carried across 2 different decades of her life. "The kid with the rifle," he said quietly, once the compound had fallen away behind them into distance and smoke. "Why didn't you take the shot?" Delaney was quiet for a long moment, watching the desert scroll past beneath them, gold and endless and completely indifferent to everything that had just happened, on one small patch of it. "Because I've done enough killing to last several lifetimes," she said finally. "Because every single person on the wrong side of a gun was somebody's child once, somebody's whole entire world, before anybody ever handed them a weapon and told them who to point it at. And because choosing not to pull the trigger when you have every justification to is sometimes the hardest, most important decision a person ever makes." Des nodded slowly, like something in her answer had settled a question he'd been carrying since the moment she'd cut his chains. "You saved my life twice now," he said. "How does a person even begin to pay that back?" "You don't pay it back." Delaney managed something close to a real smile, tired and worn but genuine. "You just keep living it forward. Every person your community center helps. Every kid who finds their footing because somebody believed in them the way I believed you'd make it out of that building 10 years ago. That's the payment. That's all any of it was ever supposed to be for." They touched down at the base an hour later, and the goodbyes that followed carried the particular weight of people who'd shared something that would live in them, quietly, for the rest of their lives, whether or not they ever spoke of it again. Foss found Delaney near the hangar entrance, and for a woman who 3 days earlier had called her a liar in front of a bar full of strangers, the hug she pulled Delaney into now came fierce and unguarded. "Thank you," Foss said, voice thick, "for showing me what real strength actually looks like. I thought I already knew. I didn't." Griffin, when his turn came, simply stood at attention and rendered a salute so precise it looked like it had been carved rather than performed. No words. None needed between two people who'd stood shoulder to shoulder in a fight that could have gone very differently. Reyes was the last to leave, and he pressed something small and worn into Delaney's palm before he went. An old challenge coin, its edges softened by years of handling, markings on it that predated most of the wars anyone in that hangar had fought. "My brother served with your original team," he said quietly. "Sergeant First Class Mickey Reyes. You knew him as Rodeo." Delaney's fingers closed slowly around the coin, and when she looked up, something in her eyes had gone soft and distant, reaching back across 10 careful years. "He talked about his little brother constantly," she said. "Said you were going to be the best Master Chief the Navy ever produced." Guess he wasn't wrong. Reyes's voice cracked, just slightly, before he composed himself again. "It's good to finally meet you properly, Master Chief." Kowalski was nowhere to be found. Delaney noticed it slowly, in the hour after landing, the particular absence of a man who should have been standing among the others, accepting thanks and shaking hands and processing the adrenaline coming down out of his system same as everyone else. She found Voss near the command tent, already deep in a debrief with 2 men in suits who were definitely not Navy, and the look on his face when he saw her approaching told her before he said a word that whatever came next wasn't going to be simple. "We have a problem," he said quietly, pulling her aside. "Kowalski." It wasn't a question, and Voss's expression confirmed it before he even opened his mouth to explain. "Cellular records from the compound's perimeter. Somebody inside our operation was feeding Cobb information for the last 3 days. Our staging location, our approach vectors, even the rough timeline of when we plan to move." Voss's jaw tightened. It's why he had that young man positioned near the extraction point. It's why he knew, almost to the hour, when to expect you. Delaney felt something cold settle in her stomach, the itch from 3 nights ago, finally, fully justified. "Kowalski, we think so." His phone pinged a tower 2 miles from the compound at 4 this morning, well before we ever briefed the final staging location to the wider team. "There's no innocent explanation for that. Where is he now?" "Gone." Voss's expression darkened further, slipped out during the extraction chaos. "We've got people looking, but..."
He's a professional.
Delaney finished the thought for him, her voice flat with the particular fury of somebody who'd trusted a man for exactly the wrong reasons and watched that trust nearly cost them everything. He knew exactly how to disappear the moment things went sideways. Because that itch, she realized, standing there in the settling dust of the compound they'd just cleared, had been trying to tell her something the entire time. The unexplained texts, the lie about a daughter that didn't exist in any file, the particular way he'd cataloged the satellite images in the hangar 3 nights ago, like a man filing away information for somebody who wasn't in that room. She should have said something sooner. Should have trusted the instinct instead of filing it away one more time, in the name of not tearing a team apart the night before a mission. But the mission had succeeded anyway. Dez was alive. Cobb was gone. And whatever Kowalski had sold, whoever he'd sold it to, it hadn't been enough in the end to undo what 12 people had built together in 3 sleepless days. "We'll find him," Voss said. "I know." Delaney's voice carried none of the fear the situation probably warranted. Only the particular, tired-out certainty of somebody who'd survived worse threats than one contractor with a grudge and a price tag. "But not today. Today, I need to go home." Reagan was waiting outside the hangar when the transport finally brought Delaney back to San Diego, sitting on the hood of her car in the exact spot Delaney had claimed 3 mornings ago, with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands. She stood the moment she saw Delaney approaching, and neither of them said anything. For a long moment, just stood there in the fading afternoon light, taking each other in, like they were meeting for the first time all over again. "You came back," Reagan said finally, her voice cracking on the words. "I told you I would. You also told me nurses disappear for 3 days without warning." And yet, Reagan let out a wet laugh, somewhere between relief and residual terror. "I've had a very educational few days, Delaney. I'm sorry." "Don't." Reagan pulled her into a hug before she could say anything else. Fierce and unrelenting, the kind that had nothing careful left in it at all. "Don't apologize for surviving something that clearly cost you everything once already. Just tell me. All of it. You promised." They sat on the hood of the car together as the sun went down, and for the first time in 10 years, Delaney told her sister everything. The team that hadn't come home, the 16 hours alone in a burning building, the 73 strangers she'd carried, one desperate group at a time, toward an extraction point that had felt for most of that night impossibly far away. The decade of silence that had followed, built not from shame, but from a grief too large to know how to share. Reagan listened without interrupting, tears tracking silently down her face. And when Delaney finally finished, when the whole enormous weight of it had finally been set down in the open air between them, Reagan simply reached over and took her hand. "I was going to run the story," she said quietly. "The station wanted it. Viral bar video, mystery hero identity, the whole thing. I had the footage. I had the headline written before I even knew it was you. Why didn't you?" "Because you're my sister." Reagan's voice was steady now, certain in a way it hadn't been in days. "Because some things matter more than a byline. I killed the story this morning. Told my editor I couldn't verify the details." She managed a small, watery smile. "Which was true. I couldn't verify them. Not until you just told me yourself." Delaney felt something in her chest loosen that had been tight for 10 straight years. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me." Reagan squeezed her hand. "Just don't disappear on me again. Not like that. Whatever else you have to do, whoever else you have to be, I want to know. Even the dangerous parts, especially the dangerous parts." "Okay." Delaney squeezed back. "Okay. I promise." 6 weeks later, Delaney stood in the hospital's administrative office, an envelope in her hands that had arrived by courier that morning. Official government letterhead, her name, printed clean and formal across the front for the first time in 10 years. Inside, discharge papers. The real ones this time. A clerical correction, the cover letter explained in the careful bureaucratic language of an institution admitting an old mistake without quite apologizing for it. Master Chief Delaney Shaw had never officially been declared deceased. Only missing in action, a distinction that had apparently mattered enormously to somebody, somewhere, over the past 10 years, and had finally, quietly, been fixed. Full honors, full benefits, a retirement that had waited a decade to become official. She sat with the papers for a long time, feeling the particular strange weight of seeing her own name in print after a decade of practiced anonymity, the resurrection of an identity she genuinely believed was gone for good. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. But the message needed no introduction. "Heard congratulations are in order, Master Chief." She smiled, small and real, and typed back a single word: "Thank you." That evening, Nina found her on the hospital's rooftop break area, the one nobody else used because the door stuck and the view was mostly parking garage, and settled into the chair beside her without asking permission. "Rumor has it," Nina said, "the quiet nurse from Bay 4 just got her old rank back." Word travels fast. It travels faster when the story involves an admiral kneeling in a bar. Nina bumped her shoulder gently against Delaney's. "You good?" Delaney considered the question honestly, turning it over the way she'd learned to turn over hard questions in the 10 years since Blackwater, since the burning building, since the version of herself she used to be. "Getting there," she said finally. "Better than I've been in a long time." "Good." Nina was quiet for a moment, watching the sun sink behind the parking garage in a wash of orange that made even that unglamorous view look almost beautiful. "For what it's worth, you were always a hero to me, even before I knew about any of it. The version of you that shows up every single shift and holds somebody's hand while they're scared. That's not nothing, Delaney. That's not a smaller thing than the other part. No, Delaney agreed quietly. I don't think it is anymore. 2 months after the desert, on a quiet evening off, Delaney's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, and something in her had learned, by now, to answer those calls without hesitation. Viper 1. The voice was warm, achingly familiar in a way that made her chest tighten before the words even fully registered.
It's Des. Hey.
She smiled despite herself, settling onto her couch, the ordinary comfortable furniture of an ordinary life she'd genuinely, finally started to believe she was allowed to keep. How's the center? Growing. We got a grant last week, bigger than anything we've had before. Enough to expand the youth program, maybe hire 2 more counselors. Pride carried clear through his voice, 10 years of rebuilding audible in every word. I wanted you to be the first to know. None of this happens if you don't carry me and Marnie out of that building. I think about that every single day. You built all of this yourself, Des. I just got you to the starting line. You got me a starting line I didn't think existed. His voice went quieter, more serious. There's something else, Mark. One of our newer volunteers, she's asking about you. Says she wants to go into emergency medicine because of a story she heard about, a nurse who used to be something else entirely. Says she wants to learn to save lives the way you do it. Quiet, steady. No fanfare. Delaney felt something warm settle behind her ribs, something that had nothing to do with medals or call signs or any of the things that had defined her for most of her adult life. Tell her the fanfare's overrated, she said. Tell her the steady part is really the whole job. That night, alone in her apartment, Delaney sat at her kitchen table with 3 objects spread out in front of her under the warm lamplight. The worn challenge coin Reyes had pressed into her hand in the hanger. An old photograph of her original team, 5 faces she still carried with her every single day. A decade of grief folded carefully into the corners of her heart, where it had finally, slowly, stopped being only pain. And a new photograph. Printed and framed just that week, Des and Marnie standing in front of the community center. A dozen kids gathered around them, all of them smiling, all of them impossibly alive and free, and building something good out of the wreckage of what had almost destroyed them all. Her phone buzzed with a text. Reagan. Dinner Sunday? Mom's old recipe. You're cooking this time, you owe me. Delaney smiled and typed back. Deal. She set the phone down, and for a long moment sat quietly in the warm lamplight, feeling the particular piece of a life that had finally, after 10 long careful years, stopped being something she had to hide. Then, on the counter beside her keys, she noticed something that hadn't been there when she'd left for work that morning. A plain envelope, no return address, delivered by a courier who apparently hadn't waited around for a signature. She recognized the paper before she even opened it. Recognized, with a familiar and complicated flutter low in her stomach, the particular weight of an organization that officially didn't exist, handling problems that officially couldn't be solved through any normal channel. Inside a single typed line, your particular skill set is needed again. Consulting basis only. Complete deniability. Interested? Below it, a set of coordinates. Not Nevada this time. Somewhere closer to home. A city she recognized, a problem the message didn't spell out but didn't need to. Not for somebody who'd spent a decade learning exactly what kinds of quiet emergencies never made the evening news. Delaney held the paper for a long time under the warm kitchen light, thinking of Fazila No, thinking of the young volunteer at Desi's center who wanted to learn how to save lives the steady way, thinking of Reagan's Sunday dinner and Nina's rooftop patience, and a decade of hard-won, ordinary happiness she had absolutely no intention of giving up completely. But she thought, too, of every quiet crisis that never made headlines. Every person out there right now who needed exactly the particular set of skills she'd spent a lifetime building, skills that didn't simply disappear because she'd chosen, mostly, to spend her days healing instead. She folded the letter carefully and set it beside her phone. Tomorrow she would report for her regular shift at the hospital, save lives in the plain, honest light of an ordinary Tuesday. But tonight she had a phone call to make, because some fights never really ended. They just changed shape, changed location, waited quietly for somebody willing to answer when they called. She picked up her phone and dialed the number from memory, the same one that had once answered with a single word that changed everything. It rang once before connecting. "It's Shaw," she said quietly into the dark kitchen. "I'm listening." Outside her window, the lights of San Diego spread out toward the horizon, each one a small, steady flame representing a life, a story, a possibility for somebody somewhere that a decade of careful anonymity had never fully extinguished in her at all. Not the ghost of who she used to be, just the steady, stubborn shape of who she'd finally fully chosen to become. Cold Harbor, 10 years before a beer bottle shattered against the floor of Anchor Point. Delaney Shaw was 25 years old, lying flat on her stomach in a drainage ditch, a quarter-mile from a grain and chemical processing complex outside a town most people had never heard of, watching the sun come up gray and mean over a building that was about to take almost everything from her. She didn't know that yet. Nobody ever does right before, because that's the cruelty of it. The morning doesn't warn you. The morning just arrives, ordinary and indifferent, and you check your gear the same way you've checked it 200 times before, and you tell yourself this is just another job, another Tuesday, and you have no idea, none at all, that by nightfall 5 of the 6 names on your team roster will belong to people who used to be alive. "See Trep," she murmured into her radio, and beside her in the ditch, Master Sergeant Levi Marsh Preacher, they called him, on account of a habit of saying grace before every op like it might actually help, adjusted his scope and exhaled slow. 6 tangos visible on the north catwalk. Intel says maybe a dozen total inside. Hostages in the main processing floor. Should be quick, clean, in and out before lunch. Should be. Delaney had been in this job long enough to know that Word was doing an enormous amount of work it had no business doing. Because Intel said light resistance. Intel said a dozen disorganized extremists who'd seized the complex overnight, mostly for the cameras, mostly for the statement, holding 40-some plant workers as leverage for demands nobody upstairs was ever planning to meet. Intel said this would be over by noon. 5 hostage rescue specialists and 1 team leader going in through the loading dock, clearing floor by floor, extracting civilians. Done. Intel was wrong in almost every way a briefing can be wrong. The team moved out at 600, 6 shapes crossing open ground in the pale early light, and Delaney watched the complex grow larger ahead of them, its silhouette all rust and rebar against a sky just starting to blue. Beside her, Sergeant Theo Bragg Anvil, because the man was built like something you'd hammer horseshoes against, kept pace without a sound, his breathing steady, his eyes doing the same restless scan hers were doing. Behind them, Petty Officer Renata Cole moved with the particular economy of the best breacher Delaney had ever worked with, and behind her, Corporal Sam Okafor carried the team's only long-range optics, murmuring quiet updates on rooftop movement that nobody outside the team would ever hear. And beside Delaney, close enough that she could hear him breathing through the last of a head cold he'd refused to report to medical, walked Sergeant First Class Mickey Reyes. Rodeo. Everybody called him Rodeo, though nobody outside the team ever quite got the story of why, some half-remembered incident with a mechanical bull at a going-away party that had ended with him in a hallway cast and everybody else in tears from laughing. He'd talked 3 nights earlier about his little brother, Deshaun, back stateside, working his way up through his own career, following the same path Mickey had walked years before him. "Kid's gonna be a legend someday," Mickey had said, grinning around a cigarette he wasn't supposed to be smoking. "Better than me. Smarter than me. Watch." Delaney had laughed. Told him every big brother said that. She didn't know, walking across that field at 600, that it was the last conversation about Deshaun Reyes she and Mickey would ever have. They breached the loading dock at 614, and for exactly 4 minutes, the mission went precisely the way the briefing had promised it would. 4 minutes. Cole took the door fast and clean, and the team flowed through behind her, weapons up, calling clear on room after room in the particular rhythm of people who'd done hundreds of times together, who trusted each other's angles the way you trust your own hands. Then they hit the main processing floor, And the 12 disorganized extremists the intel had promised turned out to be closer to 60, dug into prepared positions along catwalks and behind heavy machinery, weapons that shouldn't have been available to a domestic militia group. According to every database anyone had checked twice, because somebody had lied to the analysts. Or somebody hadn't looked hard enough. Or, and this was the possibility that would keep Delaney awake most nights for the following decade, somebody had known and decided the mission was worth the risk of 6 people walking into it anyway. The first shot came from above, and Bragg went down before he even had time to call it out. Everything after that happened too fast for memory to hold on to cleanly. Later, in debriefs and depositions and the particular sterile language of after-action reports, Delaney would try to lay it out in order. And every single time, some part of the sequence would refuse to line up the same way twice. What she remembered clearly, what never blurred no matter how many years passed, was Okafor's voice over the radio, calm even as everything came apart, calling out enemy positions with the same steady cadence he'd used 100 times before, right up until the moment his voice simply wasn't there anymore. What she remembered was Cole dragging a wounded hostage behind an overturned pallet, taking 2 rounds doing it, refusing to go down until the civilian was safely behind cover, and only then, finally, allowing her legs to fold. What she remembered was Marsh, preacher, praying out loud between bursts of return fire, not for himself, she understood later, but for the 40-some terrified plant workers scattered across that floor who had no training, no weapons, no idea what to do except make themselves as small as possible and hope. And what she remembered, worse than all of it, worse than anything else that happened over the following 16 hours, was Mickey Reyes taking a position at the base of a support column, laying down covering fire so the last uninjured civilians could reach an exit route Delaney had found, and calling out to her, over the noise, over everything, go, Viper. Get them out. I've got this. He didn't have it. She learned that 4 minutes later, crawling back toward his position with a tourniquet already in hand and finding him already gone, his radio still clipped to his vest. Deshawn's name, the last thing he'd said out loud before the noise had swallowed everything. By the time full dark fell over the complex, Delaney Shaw was the only member of her team still breathing, and she had 41 civilians still trapped somewhere inside a building that had become, in the space of one catastrophic morning, an active kill zone with no extraction possible and no reinforcements coming until the sun came up again. She was 25 years old. She had shrapnel in her left thigh she hadn't had time to properly address. She had a graze along her ribs that had bled through 2 field dressings already, and she had, somewhere in the smoke and the dark and the sporadic gunfire still echoing off corrugated metal walls, 32 frightened strangers whose only hope of seeing morning rested entirely on whether one wounded woman could hold a building alone. She didn't think about the odds, couldn't afford to, because thinking about odds was a luxury for people who had backup coming. She didn't have backup coming. She had radio silence from command, a jammed frequency nobody had explained yet, and a promise she'd made it to herself in the 4 seconds after finding Mickey's body that she would rather die in that building than let one more name get added to the list of people who didn't make it out. So she moved, floor to floor, room to room, gathering civilians in small groups and moving them toward a maintenance corridor she'd identified as the only route not currently covered by hostile positions. And every single trip back into the dark for the next group felt like walking voluntarily back into a fire that had already taken everything from her once. Somewhere around hour 6, she found a young man, no older than 24, curled behind a supply cabinet, with his older sister's arm wrapped tight around his shoulders, both of them frozen in the particular stillness of people who'd stopped believing rescue was coming. "Hey!" Delaney's voice came out steadier than she felt, the same trick she'd used for a decade afterward in 100 emergency rooms, on 100 terrified families. "I need you both to move. Can you move?" The young man's eyes found hers, wide and glassy with a fear that had nothing rational left in it. "Are we going to die in here?" "No." She said it flat. "Certain. The kind of certain you build out of nothing but sheer refusal." because the alternative wasn't something she was willing to consider. Not tonight. Not on my watch. What's your name? Des, he managed. Calloway, this is my sister. Marnie. Des and Marnie. Good. I need you to stay exactly behind me, and I need you to move fast when I say move, and I need you to trust me completely for about 90 seconds. Can you do that? He nodded, though his whole body was shaking. I've got you, Delaney said, and meant it with everything she had left. I promise. I've got you. The hours blurred together after that. 6 became 10. 10 became 14. She lost track of exactly how many trips she made. Exactly how many times she pressed her back against cold metal and waited out a burst of gunfire before moving again. Exactly how many small acts of desperate, improvised courage it took to keep 32 strangers alive inside a building that seemed determined to claim every single one of them. Somewhere around hour 12, with blood loss making the edges of everything go soft and strange, she remembered thinking, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that she didn't actually mind if this was where it ended, that there were worse ways to spend the last hours of a life than fighting alone to get other people out of the dark. She thought of her mother, gone 3 years by then, and some detached, exhausted part of her mind decided that felt almost comforting, like there'd be somebody waiting on the other side of whatever came next. Then Des Calloway's hand found hers in the dark, small and shaking and desperately certain, and something in her snapped back into focus hard enough to hurt, because dying quietly wasn't an option available to her, not with 32 people still depending on the shape of her next decision. So she kept moving. By hour 16, as gray pre-dawn light finally began bleeding through the complex's shattered skylights, Delaney Shaw led the last group of civilians, Des and Marnie among them, out through the maintenance corridor toward a rally point where, impossibly, finally, the sound of approaching rotors cut through the exhausted silence of a building that had nearly killed everyone inside it. She counted heads on that final stretch of open ground, the same head count habit that would follow her for the rest of her life. 32. Every single one of the civilians she'd gathered. Every single one accounted for and breathing. She didn't remember much of what happened after that. Remembered the particular white light of the medevac helicopter's interior. Remembered a medic's voice, urgent and far away, calling out numbers that meant nothing to her anymore. Remembered very clearly one single image that stays with her clearer than almost anything else from that entire day: Des Calloway's face, streaked with dirt and dried blood, mouthing something at her through the helicopter's open door as it lifted away, words she couldn't hear over the rotor noise but understood anyway. Thank you. She died twice on that flight. The medics would tell her later, once she was well enough to hear it, that her heart had stopped completely on 2 separate occasions during the 11-minute flight to the nearest trauma center, and that both times, against odds, nobody wanted to quote out loud, it had started again. She spent the next 8 months at a military hospital, under a name that wasn't hers, recovering from injuries that took most of that time simply to stabilize, let alone heal. 67 separate wounds, the surgeons told her eventually, once she was lucid enough to ask and steady enough to hear the answer. Shrapnel, gunshot, blast trauma from a secondary explosion she barely remembered happening. And when she finally emerged from that hospital, thin and scarred, and carrying a decade's worth of grief compressed into 8 impossible months, she learned the second devastating truth of Cold Harbor. Every single member of her team, Mickey, Levi, Renata, Theo, Sam, had been publicly listed as killed in action, and somewhere in the confusion of casualty reports and classified operation details, and a bureaucracy that had never quite figured out how to properly account for a survivor who'd technically died twice on a helicopter, Master Chief Delaney Shaw had been quietly, mistakenly, filed away as missing, presumed dead alongside them. Nobody corrected the error, for reasons she wouldn't fully understand for another 10 years. Nobody in a position to fix that mistake ever did. So Delaney Shaw, 25 years old, the last survivor of a mission that should have killed her twice, walked out of that hospital into a world that believed her already gone. and made a decision that would shape the next full decade of her life. She let them believe it, not out of shame, not out of fear, but because grief. She'd learned in that hospital bed, staring at a ceiling for 8 straight months, needed somewhere to go. And she didn't know how to carry the weight of 5 names lost under her command and still function as the person the uniform expected her to be. So she became someone else instead, enrolled in an accelerated nursing program under her own real name, quietly, in a city far from where anyone had known Master Chief Shaw. Built a life around scrubs and 12-hour shifts and the particular, specific relief of saving lives without ever one having to end one. She told herself it was temporary, a season of healing before she figured out what came next. The season lasted 10 years. The man who led the militia at Cold Harbor was captured 3 days after the siege ended, dragged out of a collapsed section of the complex, where he'd been hiding among the wreckage, waiting either for reinforcements that never came or for a death he'd apparently decided was preferable to surrender. His name was Silas Cobb. 37 years old at the time, already infamous within certain federal watch lists for years of increasingly radical rhetoric that nobody had taken seriously enough soon enough to prevent what happened at the complex he'd chosen for his statement. Delaney never testified at his trial. She was still recovering, still technically listed among the dead. And by the time she was well enough to consider it, the case had already concluded. Cobb sentenced to consecutive federal terms that were supposed to keep him behind bars for the rest of his natural life. She read about the verdict in a newspaper 3 months after leaving the hospital, sitting alone in a small apartment in a city where nobody knew her name. She read Cobb's sentence, read the brief mention of the 5 service members killed during the operation, read her own name listed among them, missing, presumed dead, and felt something in her chest go very quiet and very still, because there it was, official, printed, the world's final word on who Delaney Shaw used to be. She folded the newspaper carefully, set it aside, and never spoke Cold Harbor's name out loud again for the next 10 years. Not to coworkers who complimented her calm under pressure, without ever knowing where that calm had come from. Not to friends who noticed. She always sat with her back to the wall and never asked why. Not even, eventually, to a sister who loved her completely and understood almost nothing about the years that had shaped the woman she'd become. The scar on her wrist, small and round and easy to miss unless somebody happened to grab exactly the right spot at exactly the wrong moment, was the only visible evidence left of that morning in the drainage ditch, watching the sun come up over a building that had taken 5 people she loved and given her, in exchange, 10 years of careful, deliberate invisibility. Years later, long after Anchor Point, long after Nevada, Delaney would sit across from Deshaun Reyes in a quiet corner of a Navy base coffee shop, both of them off duty, both of them finally, slowly, learning how to talk about the brother one of them had lost, and the other had never gotten to properly meet. He used to talk about you constantly, she told him, turning a paper coffee cup slowly between her hands. Said you were going to be better than him, smarter, a legend someday. Deshaun's eyes went bright and distant, the particular expression of a man hearing, for the first time, exactly what his older brother had believed about him. He never told me that, he said quietly. Not directly. Big brothers don't, I guess. He was right, though. Delaney managed a small, genuine smile. You are all those things. I think he'd be proud of exactly the man you turned out to be. Deshaun was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his own coffee like it might offer him something steadying to hold on to. Tell me what happened. That night. All of it. I've read the reports 100 times, but I want to hear it from somebody who was actually there. So she told him. All of it, finally, after 10 years of carrying it entirely alone. The ambush. The 16 hours. Mickey's last words over the radio, covering fire so others could get out. The particular selfless certainty in his voice that had never once wavered, right up until the very end. He saved a lot of lives that morning, she said finally, buying me those extra minutes. I got 32 civilians out because your brother refused to stop fighting even when he already knew how it was going to end for him. Deshaun wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, unashamed, and reached across the table to take Delaney's hand in both of his. "Thank you," he said, for finishing what he started. For getting all those people home. I think that's exactly what he would have wanted, if he'd gotten to choose. Delaney squeezed his hand back, feeling, for the first time in 10 long years, like the weight of Cold Harbor had finally found somewhere honest to rest. "I think about him every single day," she said quietly. "All of them. Every single day. And I think finally, after everything, I think I'm learning how to carry it, without it breaking me all over again." Outside the coffee shop window, the base moved through an ordinary afternoon. Sailors and Marines and civilian contractors crossing the parking lot in the easy rhythm of a day that had nothing extraordinary happening in it at all. And Delaney Shaw sat quietly with the last living connection to a brother she'd watched die a decade ago, finally understanding that some debts didn't get repaid by staying silent forever. Some debts got repaid by living, fully and honestly, in the light those 5 names had bought her with everything they had left to give. Because that was the real legacy of Cold Harbor, she realized, sitting there with Deshawn's hands warm around hers. Not the medals nobody had ever pinned on her. Not the call sign that had once made grown men freeze mid-motion in a bar 3,000 miles from where it all began. Just this. An ordinary afternoon, finally spent in the open, telling the truth to someone who deserved to hear it. Just 5 names carried forward instead of buried. Just a promise, made in the dark of a burning building a decade ago, finally, fully kept.